What if the habits that made you feel abnormal were never proof that something was wrong with you, but proof that you were processing more than the people around you could see? There are people who move through life with a quiet suspicion they almost never say out loud. Not that they are failing, not that they are weak, not even that they are ordinary, but that something about the way they exist is slightly off. They get tired in conversations that seem effortless for everyone else. They replay small moments long after they end. They need more solitude than they can explain without sounding cold. Their mind does not slow down when the room gets quiet. Sometimes it gets louder. And after enough years of feeling out of step with the emotional rhythm of the world, a private question begins to form. Am I actually deep or just badly made for normal life? That is the question most people never hear behind these behaviors. Because from the outside, none of this looks glamorous. It does not look like genius. It does not look like brilliance. It often looks like overthinking, distance, awkwardness, intensity, withdrawal. A person who is simply too much in some places and not enough in others. But that may be the first mistake, because the strangest thing about certain minds is not how impressive they look. It is how easily they can be mistaken for damage. We are trained to recognize intelligence through performance. Fast answers, good grades, verbal sharpness, public confidence, the ability to move smoothly through systems built by other people. But some forms of intelligence do not appear first as performance. They appear as friction, as a mind that cannot stop asking what other people are willing to leave unexamined, as a nervous system that gets drained by surfaces, as a person who cannot fully relax inside conversations that never touch anything real, as someone who notices too much, feels too much, questions too much, and then begins to wonder whether all of that depth is actually just dysfunction with a flattering story attached to it. William James once wrote that the art of being wise is the art of knowing what to overlook. But what if your problem has never been a lack of wisdom? What if your problem is that your mind has never known how to overlook what other people can easily ignore? What if you were not built for selective blindness? Because that is where this begins. Not with superiority, not with labels, not with a fantasy that every misunderstood person is secretly exceptional. It begins with a quieter possibility that the mind you call too much may simply be a mind processing reality at a depth most environments were never built to hold. And once you see that, certain things begin to look different. Take overthinking. This is one of the first places people learn to mistrust themselves. They call themselves exhausting, difficult, impossible to calm. They make one decision and immediately see 5 consequences. They enter one conversation and later hear 10 meanings inside a single sentence. They try to rest, but the mind keeps simulating. What if that goes wrong? What did that look mean? Where does this lead? What happens after that? What am I missing? From the outside, it looks like anxiety, and sometimes it is, but not always. Sometimes what people call overthinking is not fear in its pure form. It is perception that has nowhere to go. It is a mind running more variables than the moment requires. Not because it wants to suffer, but because it naturally detects branching outcomes, hidden patterns, emotional undercurrents, and second-order consequences that other people do not immediately register. Daniel Kahneman spent years studying the mind's fast and slow systems. The quick, intuitive brain, the slower, deliberate one. But in some people, the deeper processing does not switch on only when needed. It hums in the background constantly. Not as a choice, as a default setting. That is why some minds do not simply react to reality. They model it. They rehearse conversations before they happen. Reconstruct them after they end. They run alternate futures in silence. They test emotional risk before making visible movement. They do not just live through an experience. They metabolize it from multiple angles at once. And that creates a painful confusion. Because when this happens inside someone who has never been taught how to interpret it, they do not think, my perception is unusually active. They think, Why can't I just be normal? Sometimes what you call overthinking is not weakness at all. It is pattern recognition moving faster than the world around you knows how to name. And once a person begins to live that way, another misunderstanding follows close behind. Other people start to feel strangely empty. Not because this person hates humanity, not because they think they are above everyone, not because they are incapable of warmth, but because surface level contact becomes exhausting when your mind is starving for signal and being fed noise. This is one of the loneliest experiences a reflective person can have, to be surrounded by interaction but deprived of depth. To sit in conversations full of words and still feel nothing true has arrived. To leave social situations not stimulated, not nourished, but thinned out somehow. As if your presence was used but your inner life was never met. So they start declining invitations. They stop reaching outward as often. They become selective. And because most people do not understand the difference between selectivity and arrogance, this gets misread too. But the real issue is often much sadder than pride. It is starvation. There are people who do not need more people. They need more reality inside the people they meet. A conversation that risks something. A mind that is willing to go one level deeper. A moment where nobody performs. A sentence that is not socially correct but true. Abraham Maslow once described self-actualizing people as unusually drawn toward what is genuine rather than what is merely conventional. And that matters here, because some people are not bored by others because they are impressed with themselves. They are bored because performance, politeness, and repetition leave no space for their real mind to arrive. They are not looking for attention, they are looking for contact. And when they cannot find it, solitude starts becoming less like isolation and more like protection. This is another place where the outside world often gets it wrong. A person spends more time alone and people assume something must have happened. They became antisocial, detached, emotionally unavailable, hard to reach. But for some minds, solitude is not the absence of love. It is the absence of distortion. It is the one place where the nervous system is not constantly negotiating shallow demands, where no one is asking for a trimmed down version of the self, where thought can finish its own sentence, where feeling can rise without immediate interruption, where the psyche can stop translating itself into forms other people find comfortable. Carl Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. That is the kind of loneliness many intelligent and deeply reflective people know too well. Not the loneliness of empty rooms, the loneliness of unshared depth. And because of that, they often become fiercely protective of their inner space. Not because they want less connection, but because too much false connection starts to feel like self-betrayal. They learn slowly and often painfully that not every interaction is neutral. Some people leave you clearer, others leave you noisier. Some conversations expand your inner life, others make you abandon it, so they become more careful, more boundaried, more difficult to access casually. Not because they enjoy distance, because they have discovered that closeness without resonance is one of the most exhausting things a mind can endure. For some people, solitude is not what happens when connection fails. It is the condition that makes real connection possible. And then there is another behavior that gets misread almost immediately. The staring, the drifting, the vanishing in plain sight. A person goes quiet in the middle of the day. Their eyes move somewhere far beyond the room. They miss simple details, seem absent, seem lazy, seem as though they are not fully participating in life. But that is often not absence, it is construction. There are minds that do some of their most serious work when nothing visible appears to be happening. They are building unseen architecture, exploring alternate scenarios, reordering experience, turning fragments into models, following an idea until it becomes an image, then a system, then a private theory about life. From the outside, it can look like disengagement. From the inside, it can feel like entering a workshop no one else knows exists. This is one reason many highly reflective people have always been accused of living in their heads. The accusation is sometimes true. But what people fail to grasp is that the inner world is not always an escape from life. Sometimes it is where life gets understood. Neuroscientists studying the default mode network have found that mind wandering is deeply tied to memory, future simulation, imagination, meaning making, and the construction of self. In other words, that drifting state is not always wasted consciousness. It can be one of the places where the mind integrates experience into identity, where confusion becomes pattern, where pain becomes language, where possibility becomes direction. So when certain people seem to disappear for a moment, it may be because something important is being assembled where no one can see it. What looks like absence is often inward labor, and that inward labor is usually fueled by the same thing again and again: an inability to accept surface as truth. This matters more than most people realize. Because one of the deepest traits in highly reflective minds is not rebellion for its own sake. It is difficulty pretending. They struggle to accept rules they cannot make sense of. They resist explanations that collapse under scrutiny. They feel friction inside systems that ask for obedience while insulting intelligence. They can participate, they can comply, they can perform. But somewhere in them, a question remains alive. Why? Why this rule? Why this ritual? Why this belief? Why this emotional pattern? Why this performance everyone seems willing to repeat without inspection? This is where their difference becomes socially expensive. Because most systems reward fluency, not depth. They reward adaptation, not inquiry. They reward ease of participation, not inner precision. And the person who keeps pausing to understand what others are content to inherit will not always look gifted. Sometimes they will look difficult, slow, skeptical, misaligned, unimpressed in ways that threaten people who depend on inherited certainty. But that inner resistance is not always ego. Often it is conscience fused with cognition. Viktor Frankl believed that human beings are driven not only by pleasure or power, but by meaning. And some minds are simply less able than others to keep living inside structures that feel empty of meaning. They do not reject things because rebellion is glamorous. They reject unreality because unreality is suffocating. And yet, this entire way of existing comes with a cost that should not be romanticized. Because the ability to see more is never only a gift, it is also a burden. There is fatigue in noticing what others overlook. There is loneliness in needing conversations most people do not know how to have. There is emotional wear in detecting contradiction, insincerity, instability, and falseness faster than social life allows you to respond to it honestly. There is even grief in realizing that much of what the world rewards has very little to do with truth. A mind like this is not simply bright. It is difficult to tranquilize. It does not easily rest inside appearances. It does not easily stop processing. It does not easily return to innocence once it has seen too much. Joseph Campbell once said that the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. But for certain people, that privilege does not feel like privilege at first. It feels like estrangement. Because before depth becomes language, it often feels like defect. Before insight becomes clarity, it often feels like overstimulation. Before selectivity becomes wisdom, it often feels like failure to belong. That is why so many people spend years misreading their own architecture. They think their complexity means they are broken. They think their sensitivity means they are weak. They think their distance means they are incapable of love. They think their need for silence means they have become disconnected from life. When in reality, they may have been trying to survive environments that kept asking them to flatten themselves just to be understood. And this is the point where the video could easily become dishonest. It could flatter you. It could tell you that every strange habit is proof of genius, that every lonely person is gifted, that every misunderstood soul is secretly operating on a higher plane. But that would be too easy. And worse, it would be false. Not every unusual person is profound. Not every detached person is deep. Not every overactive mind is wise. Sometimes confusion is just confusion. Sometimes anxiety is anxiety. Sometimes alienation comes from wounds, not insight. But there is still something important here. Because many people have been measured their entire lives by standards too crude to read them accurately, they were judged by sociability when what they needed was resonance, by speed when what they offered was depth, by performance when what defined them was perception, by conformity when what drove them was truth. And if you are one of those people, the deepest relief may not come from deciding that you are special. It may come from no longer assuming that your depth is a defect. That is the reframe, not superiority, not self worship, not the fantasy of being above other people, just a more precise reading of what your life may have been trying to tell you for years. That what looks like weirdness from the outside may be depth from the inside. That some of the habits you were ashamed of may not be signs that you are failing at being human. They may be signs that your mind relates to reality in ways that are harder to place, harder to soothe, and harder to simplify. And maybe that is why true intelligence is so often invisible at first, because it does not always announce itself through confidence. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, as inner friction, as withdrawal from shallow things, as the refusal to speak before something real is formed, as the strange inability to enjoy what everyone else seems perfectly comfortable pretending is enough. It is quiet. It is inconvenient. It is often misunderstood. And in a world that celebrates what is easily legible, the deeper mind does not always look extraordinary. Sometimes it just looks difficult. But difficult to place is not the same as damaged. Difficult to read is not the same as empty.